I realized that I had missed this opportunity to have conversations with her about her finances before there was an emergency, and it would have made things so much easier. I wouldn't have been playing detective. I wouldn't have been dealing with the emotional side of things. I would have been talking about what if scenarios. What if this happens, Mom? Let's get this information. Let's have a plan in place. But it didn't, and that's why I wrote my book, because I didn't want people to make the same mistake that I made. No one wants to talk about finances when they're in the hospital or when they can't pay the rent. They're like, just help me out. I don't need you to lecture me right now. Help me out. And so people need to be aware that your parents might not be nearly as prepared as you might think. My father was an attorney. He died without a will in a second marriage. I mean, of all the people who should have been prepared with legal documents, he was not. And so don't assume that your parents have taken care of everything.
Welcome to Catching Up to Fi, a podcast on mindset, money, and life for late starters of any age on their journey to financial independence. I'm Bill, and I'm a late starter.
I'm Becky, and I'm also a late starter, and we're your hosts. We're here to help you with your journey to financial independence, no matter where you're starting from.
We're going to talk to experts, other late starters, and explore topics related to our mission.
Join us as we catch up to Fi together.
Welcome back to Catching Up to Fi. I'm Bill Yount with my co-host Becky Heptig, and we have a very exciting guest for you today. But before we talk to Cameron Huddleston, we want to sort of personalize this and tell a little bit about our stories with regards to our parents, because we're talking about Mom and Dad, we need to talk about your finances. And this applies to everybody. This is universal. And this book is amazing. We probably won't get through the whole thing. We'll attempt to get through the highlights. But in the end of the day, we just encourage you to read this book. It'll help you have this conversation with your parents and actually with your kids. It's packed full of information. It's packed full of resources. And we're very excited to talk to Cameron today. But first, Becky, you have a story with your mom because you've been through this. Can you tell us a little bit about your story?
I can. And luckily, my mom actually made this easy for me. My mom lived with me for like the last 20 years of her life. We moved my mom and dad in with us. And my dad, we did that in 1999. My dad passed away in 2007. And then my mom passed in 2020. And she had been in assisted living for a couple of years at that point. But I am essentially an only child. I had a sister who died young. So my mom knew that everything was going to be on my shoulders, and she had experienced the same thing with her sister. My mom and I took care of my mom's sister who was widowed and had no children. So she knew what was going to be facing me. Plus, my mom didn't have that many assets. And so she made things easy for me from the beginning and was luckily trusted me to manage things well for her. And I was so glad that we were able to lay everything out ahead of time to make it easy for me to pay her bills and to take care of her investments. Because as their health declines, you spend so much time and mental bandwidth and emotional energy to just take care of them that it was nice not to have to worry about the physical and the money side of it. There were days when I would get off the phone with the assisted living thinking, why am I having to do their job? I mean, it was a great place, but still, it was, there's just always something that needs to be decided or that needs to be arranged. And it's a lot of effort and a lot of work, but I was just so happy that she was open. And then I want to also say, we have turned around and had conversations already with our adult children. We have actually sat down with them and laid out everything that we own, where it is, where the passwords are, what our will says. And it actually gave them, and this was a surprise to me. I just wanted to impart the information to them so that if we were hit by a bus, they wouldn't have a hard time figuring it out. But afterwards, they came to us and said, I'm so glad you told us this, because now we know that you're going to be okay in retirement, that there's not going to be a burden put on us for your financial well-being. And so that was kind of a bonus that I wasn't expecting.
So, Becky, tell us a little bit about how you did it. Did she put you on all of her accounts so that it made it easy? Did you use a durable power of attorney? Because it seems to me if they trust you enough to make you a co-signer on all of her accounts, then you're just, it's seamless.
It is. And when they moved in with us, they no longer owned a home, and they had a vehicle for a while and then sold it. So my mother, in the end, my mother actually had very few assets that even had her name on them, but my name was on her bank account, her savings account, that kind of thing. I could just write checks out of her bank account. So now we had to go to the bank and set that up while she was still healthy and mentally capable. You can't wait to do that. But we arranged everything that either it was sold or my name was put on it before I really had to take over the responsibility of everything.
At what age did you do that? Her age, your age? When did that happen?
Let's see. She was born in 21. So when they moved in with us, that made her, in her 80s. And she was still mentally capable at that point in time and very healthy. So probably somewhere in her 80s. But I would suggest that probably for most people, they're going to need to do it even sooner than that. Like I said, my parents were pretty healthy and with it. My mom was in good shape well into her 90s, but that's probably unusual.
Yeah, but she developed a disability, I think, too, with regards to losing her vision, which may have made it difficult.
She did. And that's one of the reasons that I started taking things over for her. And one of the reasons we helped her sister was a loss of eyesight. It got to where that she just couldn't do it. So, yeah, that would have happened even if they hadn't lived with me. But because they were there, it made it easy.
Well, my story is not so similar. I'm turning 58 tomorrow. And
happy birthday.
Yeah, thank you. And my mom just got admitted to the hospital last night, got a call late last night, and she lives alone. She's fiercely independent. She's given us the gift of being financially independent, but we don't know how she did it. She was a late starter. She got divorced and had to go back to work in her 50s, worked long hours until she was 70, started with few assets, much like us or you, and got to the point of financial independence at 70, and she's now 85. But she still lives alone. She lives in a split-level house where there's steps to get into it. She's unbelievably fit, and she's flirted with death several times, but come back. And she has not had the talk with us about her finances. She's given us her will, her healthcare power of attorney, her durable power of attorney. We know where her accountant is, her financial advisor, and her lawyer to access them. We know what bank she banks in, but that's about it. And she is close to the chest with conversations about money, what her assets are, what does her long-term care, her assisted living look like, because what happens when she falls and breaks her hip on these steps? And she'll end up in the emergency room, and all of a sudden it becomes a huge emergency issue. I see this day in, day out in my work as an emergency physician. So this conversation today is really important to me. I've sent this book to my sister. I've sent this book to my mother. I don't know if she'll read it because she may still be reticent, but one thing I sent them both that I think has engaged them is the ICE binder, the in case of emergency binder that's in Cameron Huddleston's book, where you fill out all the pertinent details in order to access accounts, all the information you need, passwords, where the accounts are, account numbers, all the details, so you don't lose assets. There can be assets that are out there that you have no idea where they are, and you can't harvest them. There are just so many things that need to happen. And this is just like financial literacy. We are not trained in this. It becomes an emergency for us. This is one phase of financial literacy. There is no training. This book is your course. This is where you learn how to do this. And as you said, it should be early. There is a 40-70 rule where you should talk to your parents about their finances before you're 40 or before they're 70. It is out there in the blogosphere and the webosphere, and I didn't know this rule. It just makes sense. And we think that, oh, we'll take care of it when the time comes. Well, the time could be tomorrow. And if you're not prepared, that just is a huge disruptor to the child's lives. And I look forward to talking about all the details of this book as much as we can get in, but I just hope it springs people to engage with this themselves. I mean, Cameron is an amazing resource. I don't know much out there like this. And she has her story with her mother. And there's another story with somebody in the financial literacy space that I want to tell as well. So there's a lot to talk about today. We're going to have fun.
There is. And Bill, I want to just mention that I had a situation happen in my family that a lot of times we think of these things in terms of at someone's death. But I had a situation that was just unbelievably bizarre that happened that made me realize that we also need this information for at someone's incapacitation. I had a family member that was in a horrific accident and was unconscious for about 4 months in intensive care. And he and his wife had none of the documents that you need. They didn't have a will. They didn't have a power of attorney. They didn't have anything. They were in their 50s. And they had not done any of these documents. And I hate to say that I was probably in that same boat. I was much older before Stephen and I even did a will. And I even did a talk about this at Campfire Rocky Mountain this last summer about all the estate planning documents that you need. But my niece was put in such an awful position because she was not able to do anything because she didn't have a power of attorney. Even the utilities were in her husband's name, and she needed to move out of the house. And she couldn't even turn off the utilities because they weren't in her name. So it just brought to my mind a whole new world or a new situation that we need to think about besides just at someone's death. There are other things that can happen where you still need these documents in place.
Well, we're going to bring Cameron on soon. We hope we've whet your appetite to this topic. This is very contemporary. This is important. It applies to our entire audience. It applies to the entire world, really. This is a big topic, and we're happy to bring it to you. They were talking about how to have essential conversations with your parents about their finances. But first, we want to let you know about a great way to support this podcast and our platform. You can buy us a coffee, and that's a way to help us defray some of the costs of the podcast. So go to our website, click the Support Us link, and buy us a coffee. We'd love it and appreciate your support. Now, we've told our stories, my mother's story and Becky's story, but today our guest, Cameron Huddleston, who's the author of Mom and Dad, We Need to Talk, How to Have Essential Conversations with Your Parents About Their Finances. Well, she's an award-winning journalist with 20 years of experience writing about personal finance. Her work has appeared in Forbes, Kiplinger's, Personal Finance, Chicago Tribune, MSN, Yahoo, and many, many more print and online publications. The U.S. News and World Report named her one of the top personal finance experts to follow on Twitter. She's appeared on CNBC, MSNBC, CNN, Fox and Friends. I can't believe she's on Catching Up to 5. She's also been on ABC News, Wall Street Journal Radio, NPR, and more than 30 podcasts. You can now count ours as one of them. She is also interviewed and quoted as an expert on the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Cameron has an MA in Economic Journalism from American University and a BA in Journalism and Russian Studies, that's interesting, from Washington and Lee University. She's also a mom of 3 young kids who, in her words, are so stinking cute, smart, and awesome most of the time. Her husband is an economics professor at a state university, so you can imagine what life must be like for their kids. Gosh, I wish I had this problem. When they want something, their dad makes them do a cost-benefit analysis, and she tells them to wait for it to go on sale or use their own money to buy it. They know their needs from their wants, and I did not. She's also a daughter She was part of the sandwich generation for 12 years as she juggled raising her kids while caring for her mom, who had Alzheimer's disease. It was a stressful situation she wouldn't wish on anybody, but it gave her great insight into how financially devastating Alzheimer's and dementia can be, and it made her realize how important it is for adult children to be having conversations with their parents about their finances before a health issue or other emergency leaves their parents unable to manage their finances on their own. We are so excited to speak with Cameron today. Welcome to Catching Up to Fi.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, you've got a story, and our audience thrives on stories. Let's start by telling your story with your mom and the challenges you faced.
Sure. So I'm going to actually start before she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. I'm from Kentucky, and my mom was in Kentucky, and my husband and I moved from Washington, D.C. back to my hometown in the summer of 2003. And because I was working for Kiplinger's Personal Finance as a personal finance journalist, I had written articles about long-term care insurance. And so I mentioned to my mom that she should look into getting a long-term care insurance policy to help cover the cost of care if she ever needed it. And I knew that this was important because she was living on her own. She and my dad had been divorced, and actually my father had passed away a few years earlier, and thought it would be a good idea. She took my advice, but she could not get a policy because she had a pre-existing condition. It was not Alzheimer's, it was something else, but it made her too high risk. And of course, I can look back on that conversation now and say, wow, I really dropped the ball because I didn't use that opportunity to have more conversations with her to say, okay, Mom, you couldn't get long-term care insurance. Let's talk about how you would pay for care if you needed it. Let's talk about what sort of care you would want. I didn't. Like I said, I dropped the ball. And then a few years later, I started noticing signs of memory loss. And at that point, I was afraid to have a conversation with her because it meant telling her, Mom, we need to talk because you're forgetting things and I'm worried. And I wasn't afraid to talk to her about her finances. I just didn't want to have to be the one to tell her that I thought she was experiencing dementia. And so I stalled. And luckily, one of her friends encouraged her to meet with a doctor to be evaluated, and found out that she did have Alzheimer's disease. And I was like, oh my goodness, we've got to take action right now. I got her in to meet with an estate planning attorney to update all of her documents. And she was still competent enough to do this. And so she named me her power of attorney, her healthcare proxy. She updated her will, her living will. And then I slowly started getting involved with her finances, but I had to play detective because she was already forgetting a lot of the details. And I realized that I had missed this opportunity to have conversations with her about her finances before there was an emergency. And it would have made things so much easier. I wouldn't have been playing detective. I wouldn't have been dealing with the emotional side of things. I would have been talking about what if scenarios. What if this happens, Mom? Let's get this information. Let's have a plan in place. But I didn't. And that's why I wrote my book, because I didn't want people to make the same mistake that I made.
How did it work out? What did you have to do to help her with her finances and manage that transition to long-term care, end of life?
So the first thing that we did after meeting with the attorney, which is a really good first step, because not only are you making sure that those legal documents are in place, and they need to be in place while someone is still competent enough to sign them. Like if you are in the middle or late stage of Alzheimer's disease, if you had a stroke and you're incapacitated, it's too late to have these legal documents drafted and signed. And so, like I mentioned, I was named her power of attorney so I could have access to her financial accounts. I was named her healthcare power of attorney so I could make medical decisions for her. And the attorney, when we met with her, suggested that we go to my mom's bank and show them that power of attorney document. And that's something you have to do. Like, the bank's just not going to take your word for it that you are your parents' power of attorney. They have to look out for their customers' well-being. And so you've got to prove that you have the legal right to access your parents' account. But going together with my mom was a really smart move, because sometimes people face pushback from financial institutions. They might tell you, oh, well, we have our own documents that we have to sign. Well, I mean, the truth is that in most states, almost all states really, financial institutions have to accept those documents. Even if they were written 5 years ago, 10 years ago, they might claim that they're stale, that they're old, but they've got to accept those documents. They might make you jump through hoops. But if you're there with your parent, it sends a signal to the bank that, hey, here's our customer, and this is the person they have entrusted. They're together. And so we went to the bank together, and I was added to my mom's account as her power of attorney so that I could start making transactions if necessary. But I didn't do that. Like, I didn't jump in and take over her finances. What I started doing is monitoring her accounts from behind the scenes. I was lucky. She was not tech savvy, and so I was able to set up online access to her bank account. She had not done that already. And I would just kind of watch and see where her money was going, making sure that she wasn't donating all of her money to every organization that asked for a donation, which was an issue. I saw that she was sitting on a lot of cash in her checking account, and I thought, well, this isn't safe. And so I had a conversation with her. Mom, I think we need to move some of this cash from your checking account into a safer place where it's not so easily accessible. So she agreed to do that, and we went back to the bank and moved some of that money actually into a fixed annuity, knowing that there was time to let that money grow, and then I could draw on that source of funding for her care down the road. And just as she needed more and more help, I got more and more involved. She lived with me for 2 years before it got to the point where I just couldn't give her the care that she needed, and I moved her into a memory care facility. She was in memory care for 8 years, and I managed all of her finances during that time.
Wow. Cameron, would you give us just a quick picture of what things could look like if you don't have these documents in place and then something happens and you need them and it's too late?
Sure. So I have a great story that exemplifies what can happen if you don't have these documents in place. A man I interviewed for my book, who also happens to be a friend, and I'm sure listeners of this podcast will probably know this name, Doug Norman, had a father who was living on his own. Doug was in Hawaii, still in Hawaii. Doug's dad was in Colorado, and his dad was starting to show some signs of memory loss, and Doug tried to get him to agree to name him his power of attorney, but his dad pushed back, and Doug didn't want to push too hard. And so down the road, his dad ended up in the emergency room one night. Doug gets a call from the ER doctor telling him that they've had to do emergency surgery on his father. And then from that point, they moved him into a skilled nursing facility for rehabilitation. But at that point, his dementia had progressed, and he was really no longer capable of taking care of himself. Those legal documents had not been put in place, and Doug was now having to make some decisions for his dad. He was trying to sign checks for his dad to pay his medical bills. But of course, the banks noticed that the signatures looked different. Doug wasn't trying to do anything wrong. He was just trying to be helpful. And so the bank was like, well, you're not your father's power of attorney. You're going to have to go to the court to be named his conservator now, because you cannot be signing checks for your dad, or you can't get your dad to like scrawl his name while he's no longer competent to do it. And so Doug ended up spending several months going through background checks and interviews and proving that he was capable of managing his dad's finances. He had to get doctors to come and testify that his dad was no longer competent, hired an attorney for himself, for his dad, essentially had to put his dad on trial. to prove that he could no longer manage his finances on his own. And so he was named conservator for his dad. His brother was named his dad's guardian, meaning that he could make decisions about his dad's medical care. And then every year from that point on, Doug had to file a report with the court detailing how he spent his dad's money. I mean, Doug spent like $10,000 on the whole legal process, and he was spending money out of his own pocket to cover his dad's medical bills until he could get access to his dad's bank account to reimburse himself. And so this is a lot of time and money that didn't have to be spent if he had simply pushed a little bit harder and said, Dad, look, let's make sure these documents are in place. And he admitted that. He's like, I really wish I had pushed my dad harder to get that power of attorney document drafted and signed, because he could have avoided the headache of going through the court process to be named his dad's conservator.
So what happens when you die without these documents? That sounds complicated too.
So the power of attorney is something that only is in effect when you are alive. It's really important to make sure that your parents have what is called a durable power of attorney, meaning that it will remain in effect if they become mentally incapacitated. The healthcare power of attorney also is something that only remains in effect when you are living. But when you die, you want to make sure there is a will or a trust, something that spells out who gets what when you die. Because if you die without a will, then state law is going to determine who gets your assets. And I know a lot of people think, well, I don't have much. It doesn't matter. My family can sort it out. But it doesn't work that way. And it doesn't work that way for two reasons. Let's say, for example, you have stepkids, okay? And you want your stepkids to, whatever, get your house, get your car, get some money that you have set aside in a retirement account, okay? They're not blood relatives. So if there are other blood relatives, your assets typically will go to them. So you need to be specific about who gets your things, even if you don't have many things. The other issue is if you think your family's going to work it out, even if you think they get along, when money comes into the picture, people start arguing. People change. I have seen this time and time again. I've heard this from numerous estate planning attorneys. Don't count on your family members to work it out in a friendly manner. They could end up in court battling over who gets what. And this can be avoided by simply putting your wishes in writing and making sure that your parents have put their wishes in writing.
Well, in the first chapter of your book, you talk about the birds and the bees. And what do they have in common with talking to your parents about finances?
Well, this conversation is often compared with that talk because it's such an awkward conversation. A lot of parents don't want to have that conversation with their kids. And when they do, sometimes they just give their kids a book or they give them really vague descriptions like my mom did. But the thing is, I hardly got the talk. Like I said, my mom's description was so vague. Yet I managed to produce 3 children. So I figured it out. Figured out how it worked. But the thing is, it's not so easy to figure out the details of your parents' finances if you're not willing to have this conversation with them, okay? You're going to have to play detective. They might have accounts that you don't discover. And that happened with my mom. She had an account that I didn't even know existed until I was getting notices from the state that it was going to be turned over as unclaimed property for inactivity. And this was when she was already in a memory care facility. I was like, wait, what is this account? $50,000 in the account that was about to be turned over to the state as unclaimed property. And so I was able, as her power of attorney, to get access to it. I did have to jump through a few hoops, and I was like, okay, let's cash out this account and use it to pay for her care. But it's just so much more difficult to figure these things out if your parents haven't shared the information with you. And I know these conversations seem awkward. They seem like that awkward birds and bees conversation. But, as Doug's stories exemplifies, the consequences of not having these conversations can be a lot worse, a lot more awkward. Oh, your parent's in the hospital. Well, are you the power of attorney? Can you sign checks for the parent? No, I'm sorry. We can't help you. We can't give you access. I mean, talk about awkward. Talk about showing up at the hospital and your parent hasn't named you healthcare power of attorney. The doctor's not going to talk to you. Or maybe your parent's on life support and you have no idea whether your parent wants to remain on life support because you don't know if there's an advance directive. And you're having to make these decisions. And it's so important to know what your parents' wishes are so that you can honor those wishes. And that's how you can get your parents to open up, is to let them know, hey, I want to know what your wishes are so that I can honor them. Don't make me guess.
I had faced a situation where we had all the documents in place and I had a DNR that was on file at the assisted living. And then I happened to find out, because a friend of mine was a nurse, that every time I went to the hospital with my mom, I needed a physical copy of that piece of paper in my hands for them to put in the file. She said, if the hospital does not have her DNR on file for that visit, they can't honor it. They are required by law to try and resuscitate her. And I thought, oh my goodness, that was just one little piece I didn't know that would have been.
I see this. I see this all the time. It is the rare occasion that people have these documents. I mean, it's 1%, 5%. It's almost nobody. And you need family that you can trust their family and have their best interest at heart, because you're forced to make decisions with very little information. It's hard and it's not ideal. You almost want to have DNR tattooed on people's skin. So, that's, or a bracelet where it says that's sort of legal, because that may be all you have. And then we are forced in the ER to resuscitate people. And then people figure it out after, and you have the time to say, okay, we need to withdraw care. And that's how this often gets figured out, is it gives you 24, 48 hours to get your ducks in a row. And the emergency doc is strapped. Our hands are often tied behind our backs. And it's a joy when family's involved, they're present, they even have the paperwork. It makes things, and the decisions have been made prospectively. It makes it so much easier where you can say, okay, we've reached that time. We don't need to do everything. We can maintain comfort and let nature take its course. Let their wishes be honored. Now, Cameron, you talk about in your second chapter of your book, Don't Wait, Why Not? And there's a lot of facts. I just want to make sure people understand the magnitude of the problem. There's some polls you have in there. I don't know if you recall them. I can recite them for you if you don't. But you talk about a Gallup poll where half of adults, 50 to 64, don't have a will. In the AARP, 55% adults over 50 have no durable power of attorney. On a caring.com site, 50% of adults have no healthcare power of attorney. I mean, this is a huge problem. And the Insured Retirement Institute said 45% of boomers aged 53 to 69 don't have enough money saved for retirement. And the kids may not know. And in another survey, 27% of boomers think they have enough money for healthcare expenses in retirement, but they may not. And then only 5% of adults aged 55 to 60 have long-term care insurance. We want to come back around to that as we get into this conversation, because our audience wants to know a little bit about long-term care insurance. And what do you think about the magnitude of this problem? It's amazing to me.
I'm glad you pointed out those statistics, because a lot of times people think that these are conversations that only wealthy families need to have, families that have the trust so they can discuss with their kids what sort of legacy they want to pass on and who's going to run the family business. But really, these conversations are even more important in families where this planning hasn't been done, where if the parents don't have enough money to live comfortably in retirement, if they don't have enough money to cover healthcare costs, because as the child, you need to know. You need to know that your parents might be turning to you for support. You don't want to find this out at the moment when you get a call and mom can't afford her medical bills, and people who think, oh, Medicare covers everything. It doesn't cover everything. There's still out-of-pocket costs. And so our mom is struggling to pay the rent or whatever. You want to know in advance what role you might have to play in your parents' financial lives in their care as they age. And the reason I say this is because that gives you either an option to maybe make some financial decisions so that you can provide that support if you want to, or for you to have some of those tough conversations beforehand with your parents to say, look, there's only so much I can do. If you need help, here's what I can do. Here's what I can't do. And to encourage them to take steps while they can to be better prepared, to at least have those estate planning documents in place, to look into a long-term care insurance policy, maybe to meet with a financial advisor to help them figure out how to stretch what resources they have. Because if you wait until there is that emergency, that's not the time to be talking about finances. No one wants to talk about finances when they're in the hospital or when they can't pay the rent. They're like, just help me out. I don't need you to lecture me right now. Help me out. And so people need to be aware that your parents might not be nearly as prepared as you might think. My father was an attorney. He died without a will in a second marriage. I mean, of all the people who should have been prepared with legal documents, he was not. And so don't assume that your parents have taken care of everything. And if they tell you that, oh, everything is taken care of, that's great. I'm so glad to hear that. Can you share with me some information? Can you tell me where those estate planning documents are? Can you show me so that I know where to find them? Can you give me a general sense of where you stand financially, just to put me at ease? Because they might say they're doing fine, but really they're not.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that possibly the shame of not handling things well is one of the roadblocks for these conversations? Or what? Share with us some of the roadblocks of the conversation between the parent and the adult child.
Shame is a big one. So if your parents have not done well financially, they're probably embarrassed to tell you that. They also might be uncomfortable talking about money in general because they've been taught it was a taboo topic. That's very common among older generations. My father used to tell me that all the time. You don't talk about money. It's impolite. So we didn't talk about money in my family. They might be afraid to have these conversations because it brings up the issue of aging and death. And they don't want to have to think about that. They don't want to have to think about the role reversal, their kids having to potentially help them out. And so there's so many different reasons that your parents might be reluctant to have the conversation, which is why I mentioned in the book, it's a good idea to try to pinpoint before you talk to them why they might be reluctant. If money has not been a taboo topic in your family, this is probably not going to be a difficult conversation to have. But if you never talked about money growing up, and if you can think about the reasons why they might be reluctant, then when you try to have these conversations, you don't want to start by touching on those sore points. Like if you know that they're afraid to think about death, then don't start by asking them, do you have a will? Just ask them something more general, like, how's retirement going? Or what do you think retirement is going to look like for you when you do retire? If they are embarrassed about their finances, maybe the conversation starts with, hey, I found a really great app that helps me save money on whatever, groceries or when I'm shopping. Or maybe you want to talk to them about scams. I just got a call from someone claiming that they were with the IRS and then I owed back taxes and I had to pay right away with a gift card. Did you know this is a scam? You find another way to start the conversation that's not going to make them uncomfortable or put them on the defensive.
Well, you mentioned scams. I have to bring that up because my mother has succumbed to a scam. You mentioned the gift card scam. There's also the sweetheart scam. And it's unbelievable to me how they prey on the fear of the elderly, the isolation, the shame. It starts with a computer virus. Oh no, you need to do this. We've compromised your identity. If you don't do this, then it's going to be out there and your finances are completely at risk. And it has them, I couldn't believe what my mother did. It was unbelievable. I couldn't believe the amount that was involved. She was running around all over town buying Target cards and then scratching off the numbers and giving it to this stranger on the phone. I mean, the preying on trust. And the biggest problem, the reason this happened is she didn't call anybody. She was told that if she told anybody, it was all going to go down. And so for a week, this went on until she finally told her best friend and called us devastated. And she may have even spent a year's worth of spending for her on this scam. Can you talk to us a little bit about your experience with scams?
I am so sorry that your mother was a victim of one of these scams. They are so common and they are so convincing. And you're right. They play to the isolation of older adults. They know that if they can get an older adult on the phone, especially if they're living alone, that older adult's not going to hang up. Because even though sometimes they recognize that this call sounds a little bit suspicious, they're eager for that connection. And really, a great way to start talking about money with your parents is to start by warning them about scam red flags. Scammers are always coming up with new stories, but most scams have telltale signs, like telling you don't tell anyone. So if you tell your parents, hey, look, here are some things you need to watch out for. If you get a call and someone's telling you that you have to make a payment right away, and they're asking for a specific form of payment, a gift card, a wire transfer, cryptocurrency, or one of those payment apps like Zelle or Venmo, it's a scam. Okay? Legitimate organizations, government agencies, they're not going to ask you to pay with a gift card or with Venmo or with a wire transfer. That's the biggest red flag. If someone is asking you to pay in a specific way that's not a traditional form of payment. Okay? If you get a call out of the blue and they're asking you for personal information like your social security number or your account number, it's a scam. Your bank will not call you out of the blue and ask you to provide your social security number. Now, if you call your bank or your credit card company, or if you're calling whatever Medicare administration, they need to prove your identity. So they might ask for some information. But companies and legitimate organizations are not going to call out of the blue and ask you for personal information. So that's the second big red flag. You want to tell them, don't ever click on any links in emails or text messages you receive. Text message scams are so common right now. I get them, practically every week. And every week I am being told that my Netflix subscription is going to be canceled because there's some sort of fraud on my account. Well, guess what? I never respond. I still have Netflix. And I know it's a scam because the Netflix subscription is in my husband's name. Okay, so tell your parents, don't click on links and unsolicited emails or text messages. If they're getting a phone call or an email or a text message that's supposedly from their bank and they're alerting you to some sign of fraud, hang up, don't respond, and then call your bank directly. Call that company directly and say, hey, I just got this message, or I just got this call. Were you trying to reach me? Encourage them to reach out to you. Hey, if you ever get any sort of suspicious call, email, text, or letter, please don't hesitate to reach out to me and ask me, do you think this is legitimate or do you think it's a scam? It's so important to keep those lines of communication open with your parents and to let them know it's okay to come to you. You don't want them to feel embarrassed. And you definitely, if they ever become victim of a scam, you definitely don't want to make them feel like it's their fault, because then they're never going to come to you again for support. They're going to be too embarrassed to tell you that they've been taken advantage of.
So what kind of steps do we take to avoid scams? Are there certain things you can do? I mean, I just got a text yesterday that said, oh, you just bought a Mac computer for $1,400 from Amazon. And then I run onto my Amazon account and see what the orders are. I look at my credit card, and it didn't happen. but there's a link. It's amazing the plethora of ways in which these scams are perpetrated. And it even happened to my wife. The police called her and said, we're going to arrest you at your office unless you do this because of this thing. I mean, they led her to believe that there was a legal issue and it sounded legitimate. We had to call our lawyer and said, what is this? He said, it's a scam. Hang up.
Usually, like I said, if there is this request for a payment right there on the spot, and they're asking for an unusual form of payment, like the gift card, the wire transfer, it's a scam. I got one of those calls several years ago from someone claiming to be with the sheriff's department, telling me that I had failed to show up for grand jury duty. And I'm like, what are you talking about?
That's exactly what happened to my wife. She failed. That's what it was. She failed to show up for a court appointment. I never heard that one.
And I hadn't heard it either. And I was aware of a lot of scams because I've been a personal finance journalist for a long time, but I hadn't heard that one. And like I said, scammers are always coming up with new stories. And as soon as this guy tells me, like, he's telling me he's with the sheriff's department, I'm like, okay. And so then I'm like on my computer trying to like find this guy and the name or whatever. But as soon as he said, you've got to go to the grocery store and you've got to get a prepaid card and go down to the jail and pay at this kiosk, that was it. That was the one red flag that I needed to tell me it was a scam. And so actually what I did do, and I'm like, oh, okay, hang on. Give me a number. Let me call you back. I've got to go get this. And then I called the sheriff's department. I said, hey, I got this guy who's telling me. So put them both on the line together, and that was it.
Wow.
Whatever. But you just have to be skeptical. Like, you have to be skeptical about everything. And Billy, you did the right thing. You get that text message, don't respond to the text message or the email. Check on your own. Go look at your account. Go look at your credit card transaction history. Call the company directly and say, hey, were you trying to contact me? So what you can do is have the conversation with your parents. Actually, on my website at CameronHuddleston.com, I have this free downloadable scam red flags sheet that you can print out, hang it up by your parents' phone, hang it up by their computer, hang it up on their refrigerator, put it all over the house. What you could also do is make sure that your parents are taking advantage of their cell phone service providers' spam blocking app. Most of these service providers offer one for free, and it's going to let you know if the call is most likely a spam call and you don't have to answer it. Tell your parents, don't answer the phone. Let calls go to voicemail, and then you can review those voicemail messages and decide whether you want to call back. Again, if it sounds somewhat suspicious, don't call the number that they've left you. Reach out to that company directly. You could help your parents freeze their credit reports so that if they do give out their personal information to a scammer, they're going to limit the damage, because if they freeze their credit reports, then new lines of credit cannot be open in their name. So you're going to go to all three credit bureaus, Experian, Equifax, TransUnion, sit down with them, help them activate that security freeze. They're going to have to create a password and a username. So write it down so that they don't lose it. And then if they do need to apply for credit in the future, they'll be able to lift that for free if they want to. And it's free of charge to place a security freeze. And so that's a good way to help protect them too.
Nice. So Cameron, I just wanted to reiterate for our audience that there is a ton of detail in your book that we have not dived deep into during the recording today. So I want to encourage everybody to go get your book and read it, because there's so much good detail. Like, why is it hard to have these conversations? Why do you even need to have these conversations? So what I want to do right now is to fast forward a little bit to chapter 5, which is talking to your siblings. Now, my particular situation, I'm an only child. So I didn't have siblings. And it was interesting. There were many times when I would make the comment of, I wish I had a sibling to help. But on the other hand, I didn't have anybody I had to argue with. So it was kind of a catch-22. But so if you do have siblings, what considerations do you need to make in that arena?
I think it's important actually to talk to your siblings before you talk to your parents. This is so that you can all get on the same page. If you go to mom and dad without talking to your siblings first, and I say mom and dad, I mean, it might just be mom, or it might just be dad, or it might be mom and stepdad, dad and stepmom. I'm just saying mom and dad, just kind of a general blanket term here. If you go to your parents first without talking to your siblings, they might think that you're going behind their back. They might think that you're trying to get in good with mom and dad so that you get everything when they die. Or you don't want them to become suspicious. You don't want them to think that you're trying to leave them out of the conversation. And so reach out to your siblings first and say, hey, I think we should talk to mom and dad about their finances. Let's decide who's going to start the conversation. Is it one of us or all of us? Or just some of us, if there's several of you? When is going to be the best time to have the conversation? And I will tell you that during a holiday family gathering is not the best time to have these conversations. People think it is. Oh, we're all together. Pass the turkey. Mom and dad tell us, do you have a will? There can be people at that family dinner who don't need to be part of the conversation. And a lot of times those holiday meals can be stressful already. And so if you introduce the topic of money, it can make it even more stressful. And if someone's had a little too much to drink, that conversation is really going to go downhill fast. And so don't have the conversation during the middle of a big family holiday gathering. Do it, wait till the day after if possible, or just say, hey, we want to talk. Let's find a time when we can do this, where we can just sit down and not have to rush. And if you've got siblings who don't want to be part of the conversation, it's okay. Just say, look, we're going to have the conversation. I'll keep you updated, because you never know when down the road if they want to get involved at some point. And if they feel like they've been left out, that can create problems. If you are having trouble coming to an agreement with your siblings about who's going to start the conversation, it's a good idea to remind everyone, look, maybe we've had issues in the past. Maybe we don't get along the best, but we need to try to put that aside, because we need to think about what's best for mom and dad. We've got to come together now and put aside all of our differences. If you want to continue hating me after mom and dad are gone, that's fine. But right now we have to come together because we need to do what's best for mom and dad. And we need to let them know that we are in agreement, because oftentimes parents are afraid to have these conversations because they think it's going to lead to arguments among their kids. And so letting your parents know that you're kind of working together, that can make it easier for your parents to sit down and have these conversations. So talk to your siblings first, keep them in the loop if they don't want to participate in those conversations, so that there's not any hard feelings down the road.
Yeah, actually, the way that I generated this conversation, and we were thinking about the day after Thanksgiving, and my sister was like, absolutely not. We can't tarnish the holiday with this conversation. Politics, religion, don't talk about it. At any rate, sent my sister the book, sent my mother the book. But more importantly, what is generating the conversation, and there is one of these on your website, is the ice binder. I found this very interesting. The in case of emergency, my mom was like, downloaded it. She still writes checks. She still writes longhand, beautiful cursive, and she's filling out your ice binder. And that, once she hands it over, is a perfect way into this conversation. I find it amazing, and I would encourage everybody to go to your website to download this. And it's one way of generating the conversation, because it's a pull, not a push. I learned from my kids. I was called lecture daddy. And when I was talking to them about finances, you need to do this, you need to do that. And this is, again, not the way, because you talk about what not to say. What are the things you should absolutely not say in order to engender this trust and this pull towards this conversation?
Well, you don't want to be condescending, that's for sure, because this is already somewhat of a role reversal. The kids asking the parents to do something for them, not like asking, please take me to soccer practice after school, but asking them to share what they might consider to be private information. So you want to approach it from a place of love and respect, not like, mom and dad, I'm worried that you're going to get scammed, or I'm worried that you're not going to do well in retirement and you're going to have to ask for help for me. I mean, that's going to put them on the defensive right away. So you want to let them know, look, I want to be able to help you if you ever need help. But to do that, I need some information. You don't want to issue ultimatums. You don't want to say something like, if you don't tell me anything, then I'm not going to help you, because that's not going to make them open up to you. You don't want to appear greedy. You don't want to say, hey, where's your will? I want to know what I'm getting when you die. I mean, most people aren't going to say that, but you want to make sure that you're not even implying that you're looking out for yourself. You're looking out for them. You want to be able to help them if something happens. And so that's the whole point of these conversations.
Mm-hmm. And I would imagine that your parents don't want to feel like you're treating them as incapable or as a kid. So this is almost we're going to work on this together. Let's be a team to accomplish what we need to accomplish. And one of the things I got from your book is it's not just money that you need to talk about. I mean, there's other areas too. We've talked about what are their desires for long-term care when their health starts to decline. What kinds of things do they see for them, and do they want a do not resuscitate order, and all the way down to what do you want? I mean, if you can have this conversation, what do you want for your service, your funeral? My mom had a sister that didn't have any children or a spouse, and so my mom and I helped take care of her. And at her death, we found a list of exactly what she wanted, down to what type and color of flowers she wanted on her casket. So it literally we just took this list to the funeral home and said, this is what we want to happen. It was so easy.
I don't even know where my mom wants to be buried, and that's kind of stressing me out. Our family is kind of dispersed, and I'm like, well, what do you want? This brings up sort of that letter that you add to your will that sort of talks about what are the issues that aren't in the will that honor the desires that I have after I die. I mean, for example, my wife, I've told her, I want to be cremated. I want to have my ashes spread in Chicago. I want some of them in Berlin. You're going to travel to disperse me, and I want some of them in Colorado. So in order to honor my wishes, you've got to travel, which isn't a bad thing, right? Destination trips.
And it's good that you've told her it is. I mean, you could let your parents know, look, think of this as a gift to me. It's going to be a difficult time. I love you, Mom and Dad. And when you're gone, I want to be able to honor your wishes. It's going to be hard for me. And if you tell me exactly what you want, then it's going to make the loss of you a little bit easier, which is true. I mean, it is like you're grieving. The last thing you want to do is make these decisions and feel guilt, like you've made the wrong decision because you don't know what your parents want. My dad never told anyone what he wanted. He would jokingly say, sharpen my toes and hammer me into the ground. And I remember my mom telling me after they got divorced, you got to find out what your dad wants. Well, did I listen to my mom? No, I didn't listen to my mom. I didn't have that conversation with him soon enough. But he passed away at a really young age. He was 61. My stepmother made all the decisions. It was fine, but I'm so grateful that my mother shared exactly what she wanted with me before she started experiencing any memory loss. I mean, I've told my kids, they already know, and they're teenagers. So I just think that we've got to get past this fear of having these conversations. And I know some people think, oh, well, if I talk about it, it's going to happen. I mean, we're all going to die. Talking about it does not make it happen any sooner than it already will. And my dad didn't talk about it. He died at 61. My husband and I have already written and rewritten a will, and we're still alive. We are still here. We've gone through the process twice, but people think if I do it, it's going to happen. No, if you do it, it means there's a plan, and you're going to make it easier for those you leave behind. And getting back to long-term care planning, that is so important to have a plan. You can't think it's not going to happen to me. You can't think it's not going to happen to my parents, because more than half of adults 65 and older will need long-term care at some point. And Medicare does not cover the cost of long-term care. Surprise! I mean, most people think it will, but it doesn't. Medicaid will cover it, but you've got to qualify for Medicaid, which means you have to have very limited income and assets. Sometimes it will only cover care it'll cover care in a skilled nursing facility. In every state, it can cover care at home. Only in some states will it cover care in an assisted living facility. And you don't need skilled nursing care in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. I mean, you could be at home, or maybe you're fine with someone coming in a few days a week. But you've got to have a plan, and you've got to have a way to pay for it. And I know people think, well, if something happens to mom and dad, I'll take care of them. But you need to know that caregiving can be a full-time job. And if you've already got a job and you've got your own family relying on you, can you afford to quit that job to take care of your parent? I mean, probably not. It doesn't mean that you're abandoning your parent. It means that you are coming up with a plan so that your parent can get the best care that he or she deserves. And you might not be qualified to provide that care, and it's expensive.
Well, the interesting thing is this really probably, and it hasn't been traditionally included in an investor policy statement, because this can blow up your retirement. And the plans you have as the sandwich generation person is not just about college that can blow up your retirement. It's about long-term care. And just to give our audience a few facts, and you have them in your book, because again, this gives us the scope of the problem. In 2018, the nationwide retirement survey said 56% of respondents would rather die than live in a nursing home. 70% of adults greater than 65 will need long-term care. The average length of long-term care is 3.9 years. That's expensive. Women are a little longer than men, obviously, 4.4 years versus men's 3.2 years. And a quarter of Americans turning 65 will have long-term care costs of at least $100,000. 15% will have costs that exceed $250,000. And again, Medicare does not cover this. Now, I've seen also that there's a term called Medicare divorce, where you get to the point in a marriage where you can't afford your spouse's care, and you end up having to divorce them so they can get Medicaid. Isn't that correct?
There are a variety of ways that you can qualify for Medicaid. It's often referred to as Medicaid planning, things that you can do in advance by transferring some assets, creating a trust. But again, that takes planning. I mean, you mentioned the $100,000 figure, the $250,000 figure. The median monthly cost of a room in an assisted living facility is around $4,500. Okay? It's about the same if you bring an aide into your house to care for your parent or for yourself. Facility, we're talking $8,000-$9,000 a month for a private room. And those are just the median cost. If you live in a place where the cost of living is high, it's going to be a lot more expensive. I mean, the cost of my mother's care was more than $500,000. More than $500,000. How many people have more than $500,000 or even $200,000 or $100,000 to spare to pay for care? I mean, if you have a plan, there are ways to pay for it, including long-term care insurance. You've got to be healthy to get it. If you're in your late 50s, early 60s, and you're still healthy, you will probably qualify for a policy. It's not cheap. It's a lot cheaper than $4,500 a month for assisted living. If you have a permanent life insurance policy with cash value, you can draw on that cash value. There's something called a life settlement where you sell your life insurance policy for more than the cash value. It's not as much as the death benefit's going to be, but that's money. There's a reverse mortgage. There's that Medicaid planning that you can do. There are options, but most of them do take planning.
You also talk about, as a way of paying it, long-term care annuities. There are VA benefits. And one of the things that people have is their house. And you can use your house in some ways as a long-term care policy using a reverse mortgage. You mentioned too, and you may have discussed it a little bit, but it's called a hybrid policy. Can you take us through what a hybrid policy is?
Sure. So these have become a lot more popular than a traditional long-term care insurance policy. With a traditional long-term care insurance policy, you're paying in, and if you never end up needing long-term care insurance, then no one gets any money at the end of the day. They do have shared policies where if you have a spouse or a partner, You can have a share policy where there's a pool of money. And so if you don't need it, but your partner needs long-term care, then all the money in that policy can go to cover your partner's care. A hybrid policy is a combination between life insurance and long-term care benefits. And people like this because someone's going to get paid at the end of the day. If you need long-term care coverage, then that hybrid policy will help cover the cost of your long-term care. If you don't ever need long-term care, then there's a death benefit and your beneficiaries are going to get a payout when you die. These do tend to be more expensive than a traditional long-term care insurance policy, and that long-term care coverage isn't as robust as a traditional policy. But like I said, people like it because they like the idea that someone's going to get money out of it. And some people really don't like the idea of putting money into a traditional long-term care insurance policy if they think they're just throwing their money away if they're never going to need long-term care. And so it's an option. It can be easier sometimes to qualify for these sort of policies than a traditional long-term care insurance policy. And so I encourage people to meet with an independent insurance broker. Let's just use an example here. Let's say that you have your life insurance through a particular insurer, and you want to ask if they offer a hybrid policy or long-term care insurance. They're only going to be looking at the policies that that insurance company offers. An independent broker is going to look at a variety of policies and types of coverage from a variety of insurance companies. And so that's really your best option.
Do you have these resources in your book that people can sort of search and find these specialty insurance brokers?
I do. I mentioned a couple of independent brokers, and I mentioned there's an association for long-term care insurance, and I've got that website listed in my book.
I mean, I look at your book as kind of the Bible of talking to your parents about these issues. I mean, there is just so much there, and it's a resource. It's kind of like an encyclopedia of what do you do. So I'm very appreciative of this, and it's really something I should have read earlier in life, because there is the 70-40 rule, right? Or the 40-70 rule that people talk about, where before you're 40, you should talk to your parents about their finances and all the issues that go along with aging, or before they're 70. And we wait till the 80s, we wait till the 90s, and there may not be enough time because these conversations don't occur in one sitting, right?
You're right. And if you've got a parent who's reluctant to talk, it could take a while for them to get comfortable with the idea of sharing information with you. I have a friend, she's a financial planner, and she had been trying for years just to get some basic information from her mom about whether she had estate planning documents, and her mom didn't want to share anything with her. And after trying for years, her mom finally came around and agreed to start sharing some information. And so that's a worst case scenario, but it can take a while. And so the sooner you start, the better it's going to be, because if you've got that parent who's reluctant, you might be spending months or years trying to slowly pull a little bit of information out of them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Cameron, one of the things that my husband and I have tried to do that Bill and I talked about at the very beginning was, as you call, paying it forward to your kids. Most of our audience may have young adult children or children that are in college of their own. And so we need to think about what we need to tell our kids. We have 3 grown kids that are in their 30s. And so we've sat them down and said, here's what we own. Here's where it is. Here's how you get to it. But then you have made me realize that we still haven't completed everything. Like, I haven't told them what would I want if something were to happen to me, if I were in an accident and die, or if I were to have a stroke or heart attack or some kind of accident and end up in the ER. What do I want? What kind of decisions do I want you to make for me? So a lot of times we think about what needs to happen at death with all of the documents, the will, the power of attorney, or the trust, whatever it may be. But there are other situations where they may need to step in and start making decisions. And so we've we've done a good job of one area, but you've made me realize that we haven't completed it yet.
Mm-hmm. There is a lot to discuss, and it's a good idea to have these conversations with your kids, not your little bitty kids. It's a good idea to start talking about money in your household from the time your kids are little. But if you've got kids who are in their 20s, their 30s, you definitely need to be having these conversations. Again, it's a series of conversations. Keep them updated. Put things in writing. Tell them where to find your documents, where to find those lists of accounts, where to find your list of passwords. If you've got a list of passwords, which they're going to need, perhaps if something happens to you, whether it's a long-term care need or when you pass away, because they're going to have to close accounts for you. Like I said, my kids are teenagers. My oldest is 19, and then I've got a 17-year-old. I actually have an 11-year-old, and I tell them things all the time. When my husband and I were traveling with our two younger kids, I called up my oldest daughter who's away at college and reminded her, hey, just in case something happens, remember, these documents are stored here and these documents are stored here. And she's like, Mom. I'm like, look, I just want you to know we're all going to be traveling. They think I'm so morbid. Why are you talking about this? I'm like, because I want you to be prepared. I want you to know.
It's kind of like the sex conversation, right? Ooh, gross. You're never going to die. I don't want to think about it. I mean, my wife has said, I'm never going to die. And I just like, no, it happens to everybody. I need to know some of these issues, but that's her thing. Right, we fear death. And honestly, we need to embrace it. Just like early on with our fears about sex, our fears about finances growing up, the earlier you start, the better. This is a late starter issue, but this is a late starter issue for everybody. I mean, you're doing it early, but I would say you're the minority. What percentage of people actually have these conversations before 40, before their parents are 70? Do you have any idea?
I know that 73% of adults have not had detailed conversations with their parents about their parents' finances. And so the majority, overwhelming majority. And what's interesting is there was one statistic I found where baby boomers were surveyed. And a lot of these boomers had actually been involved with their parents' finances, yet a lot of them had not thought to have conversations with their own children. And so, I mean, we get busy. We get busy with life. And some of us do think that we're going to live forever. I've yet to meet anyone who's managed to pull that off. They've discovered the fountain of youth. But it's a hard conversation to have. But like I said, having these conversations doesn't hasten your death. It doesn't end up leaving you needing long-term care. That's going to happen whether or not you have the conversations. But having the conversations means there's a plan. It means people aren't caught off guard. And those are really hard things to get through. It was so hard watching my mom slowly lose her memory. It was hard to have to be her caregiver because there was that role reversal. And so if you've taken care of the money conversation, it makes that difficult situation a little bit easier. It's one less thing to worry about.
Well, your book is really a checklist for this plethora of things you have to go through because you can't remember them all. It's so much. It's an unbelievable amount of information, and it really feels like it's all in your book. I can only, as I've done in this show many times, recommend it to everybody that has parents. Well, guess what? That's everybody. So I want to thank you, and I'm sure, Becky, we both thank you for your time today, for your insights, for your efforts, your work in this regard. It has opened my eyes to issues that I hadn't really given much thought to either. I didn't give much thought to my finances early on, and now I'm giving thought to this. And finally, we've engaged my mother. And the conversation may be over Zoom, but it's going to take place. And after her ice binder's in, it'll give us the opportunity where she's listed it, and hopefully we can launch from there into these other issues. So thanks again for coming on the show. Do you have any final thoughts, Becky?
I agree, Bill. This is a great checklist. In fact, Stephen and I are planning in the next few weeks to have what we call a little financial retreat. We're going to go away somewhere, spend 1 or 2 nights at a hotel and hopefully a beautiful setting, and do some year-end planning, some 2024 planning. And I'm going to take the ice binder with me. We have this information in a place that our kids know where it is, but I don't think it's as concise or easy to find as it will be if we fill out the ice binder. So I'm putting this on our list of things to do in our planning retreat.
Actually, I have a final question for you too, Becky, and maybe Cameron. Do you ever get to the point where you talk numbers? I mean, money is so taboo, and we don't talk salary. We don't talk things like this. Is it important ultimately when you get that final stage of trust that you actually know the numbers, not for your own benefit, but for really their long-term care coverage? How important was that? I mean, Becky, it sounds like you might have known them all.
Well, I knew all of them for my mom. And we have told our kids literally how much we have in our portfolio. It did feel a little odd because it's so countercultural. But as I said earlier, after we had the initial conversation to tell them literally how much money we have and how our retirement is set up, one of the kids came to us and said, "Thank you so much for telling us that, because now I don't have to worry about whether or not you're going to be okay, or whether or not I'm going to have some responsibility early on." Because as we age, there is a cost of living, which is what we hope to mitigate with the long-term care insurance. But there is also a cost of lifestyle, because even when we're still at home, there's a point where we're going to have to start paying someone to mow the grass, to clean out the gutters, to clean the house, maybe even come check our meds and cook a few meals. The costs of aging will increase as we go. And I think that our kids had a real level of comfort to know that those things were going to be taken care of. They may have to be the ones that arrange it and manage it, but they're not going to have to fund it.
Yeah, I mean, Cameron, any final thoughts from you? Any tips for our late starters?
I think whether you reveal dollar amounts depends on your comfort level. I do think it's a good idea to give your kids a sense of at least where you stand financially. If you have done a retirement calculator, if you have met with a financial advisor, if there's enough money there to support you through retirement, telling your kids, like Becky said, it's going to let your kids feel this kind of sense of relief. If you don't think there's enough, then you might want to let your kids know that you might be struggling some. Your kids are going to find out those dollars and cents at some point. They're going to find out if they have to care for you, and they're going to find out when you die. Maybe not all of your kids, but if you've named at least one of your kids the executor of your estate, they're going to find it out. So you can't hide it forever. And if you're feeling embarrassed about your financial situation, then maybe you need to be thinking, okay, well, what can I do now to improve it? What steps can I start taking so that when my kids do have to get involved, or when I do pass away, that I know that I won't be embarrassed at that point because I've taken action now to take control of my finances.
Yeah, we don't want regrets on our deathbed, and this is probably one of them. Leaving a mess, whether it be cleaning out your house and moving, or a financial mess, like you said, it's a gift to your kids, and why not give them this big of a gift? Before we end, I want to thank a few people. Fritz Bossotter is our VA for sound and video engineering. Diana Falk is our social media coordinator. Sarah von Sternberg, Becky's daughter, does our show notes. And there's a few calls to action we want to leave you with. Leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. Visit our website at catchinguptofi.com. Leave a question or a voice message through our SpeakPipe link on our contact page. Invite your friends or family. Heck, invite your enemies to our private Facebook group. They all need the information that I think we try and provide, and hopefully you find value in what we provide. Cameron, once again, this has been awesome. Thank you for your time. I look forward to an ongoing conversation with you. I hope you're willing to come back and educate us again on all these other financial topics you're an expert on.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
All right. We'll see you next time.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Catching Up to 5. We would appreciate it if you could leave a 5-star review so that our message can reach others.
We are not lawyers, financial advisors, accountants, or tax experts. Please consult your own professional advisors before making any important decisions. Our content is for entertainment and education purposes only.
We'll see you next time on Catching Up to 5.